With the help of Hashem, we are learning Taanis Daf Yutes. We will start on Daf Yutches, Amid Beis, towards the end of the Amid, by the new Mishnah, by the new Perek, the third Perek. As we spoke out when we were Messiah Perek Sheni, up until now, we were speaking about what we did, how we fasted, how we reacted, when there was a delay in the rain period. Over there, since the tzara comes gradually, therefore we reacted also in a relatively gradual process. As we learned, first you have the fast days of only Yechidim, not a imposed communal fast. Then after Rosh Chodesh Kislev, according to the sheet of our Mishnah, regarding when should the first three rains of the Revi'ah come. If that time passed and still there's no rain, so then there were three fast days. We call them the three initial fast days. Then we had the three middle fast days. Then we had the final 7 fast days. And there was a gradual progression as to how stringent were those fast days. Our Perek will begin speaking about other calamities that Chazal understand them to be of an immediate emergency. And when you have an emergency, then right away the fast days, the tiniest tzibur, are like the final 7 fast days. They come with the greatest of stringency. So we're going to learn in the beginning of today's daf about other types of calamities. Some of them were also drought related, but it was of a much more serious or severe nature. We're going to learn about what happens if there's an epidemic. How do we define halachically an epidemic and other, God forbid, tzaras that should never come to us, for which, yes, the Chazal would enact immediately the stringent fast days. We're going to learn about the concept of, even though normally we don't cry out to Hashem for personal needs on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, we did cry out, again, when you have these communal emergencies. We're going to have in the Mishnah a story of Choyni Hama'agel. We're going to have in the Gemara later a more elaborate story about Choyni Hama'agel, perhaps a more famous story of Choyni Hama'agel, someone who fell asleep, who got put to sleep for 70 years. We're going to have in the Mishnah another story. Actually, as we'll speak out in Yerushalmi, there is an opinion that says that the story of Choyni Hama'agel in the Mishnah is not the same Choyni Hama'agel that we'll have in the Gemara. The Gemara speaks about a earlier Choyni Hama'agel. The one that we will learn in the Mishnah, according to the Yerushalmi, is the grandchild of Choyni Hama'agel. Just Choyni is the name, and the word Ma'agel means the one who made circles. And as we will see, whether it's the same or whether it ran in the family, that they made a circle in the ground, and they stood inside that circle, and they told God that they will not leave the circle until their prayers are answered. And therefore they were called Choyni, the circle maker. Or in our language, in Lashon HaKodesh, Choyni, the one who makes igulim, ha-me'agel. We're going to learn, even when it comes to the more serious fast days, you have a concept called something that's bringing about a food shortage, which is bad, but not as bad as that which Chazal will define as a famine. So we're going to have some nuance of what's only relative only, considered a food shortage called a betzoirta, what's considered a kafna, which is considered a famine, and again, that will affect the severities of those fast days. And if we'll have time in today's daf, we will learn the amazing story of Nagdimain Ben Gurion. There is a certain nuance of the story that perhaps people are not that familiar with. And as we get into the sugya, again, most of the daf will be just defining how do you define different types of calamities, but we will begin, at least if we'll get to begin with Nagdim and Ben Gurion, that's going to lead us into the next daf, and we're going to start learning in this chapter a tremendous amount of very famous, and we should make them more famous, stories. I just want to give the final small intro, because I think that will be the neshama of Daf Yutes, and it's going to give us a good insight to the whole Perek. As we will see, when we have what we consider a relatively lesser of a calamity, so our reaction was accordingly. When you have a more serious calamity, then we would react much stronger. But then we will learn a concept that if something is already a done deal, if something is so bad that there is no recouping from it, then we're going to have the concept of, then there's no point to daven. It already happened. And that will really be the nigla part of Daf Yutes. And Dafka, after that, we will begin to learn how certain individuals had the power to effect a miracle. And I think the bigger message is that even when, on one hand, by the laws of nature, something already happened, a terrible thing, it already happened, there's nothing you can do, still, there's always the opening of that there's a God in the world, and God is almighty, and you have tzaddikim that have a koyach because of them being so connected to God, and they actually change the rules of nature. Now, that doesn't mean that you can impose on the community a demand for them to do something in order to affect a change in nature. That not, but such a possibility is always there. Without any further ado, with all these introductions, Chavra, let's hit the books. Let's begin with the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Chavran Daf Yudches Amid Beis in the bottom, Seder Taanis Elo Ha'amur. All of the fast days that we learned above, like we said, the Chidim, the 3, the next 3, the 7. That's only when B'Reviyah Rishoina. That's only when the Reviyah means, remember, Reviyah is an expression of copulation, which is used regarding the rainfall. And again, there's details. It's not that the first of the 3 were delayed, but as we clarified, when all of the 3 were delayed, that is when we enacted, that was Rosh Chodesh Kislev, the first 3 of the communal fast days, and it's gradual. Avol Tzmachim Shoshanu. The word Shoshanu means if there was some sort of change in the that which is coming out of the ground. Now, what type of change further clarified in the Gemara? But this is not a rain delay, which is bad but not terrible. This is considered already terrible. So our reaction was immediate. Masriyan Aliyah miyad. Now, guys, we had the word Masriyan before. We had the machlokes what the word Masriyan actually means. Literally, Masriyan means we cry out. Does Masriyan mean that we add the anenu, the long anenu alekenu, anenu, borenu, anenu? Does Masriyan means we blow the shofar? Maybe it means both. And I want to give you as a rule that unless specified otherwise, and people get a bit confused, Masriyan generally also includes a fast day. In other words, not only did we fast, which is what we did also in the first 3, but we fasted already with the crying out that we did in the 7. All of the most serious types of fast days, the final 7 is done miyad. And now the Mishnah gives other calamities. It's amazing. If there is a rain delay, it's bad but not terrible. If there is the first rain, what does the first rain cause? It causes for things to begin to take root. If the delay between one rain and the second rain is 40 days or more, that's considered worse. Doing something delayed is not as bad as beginning and stopping. Beginning and stopping, when it comes to the growth, it's going to kill it. So that's another reason why Masriyan Aleim, again, Masriyan means to cry out, but again, here it means that we fasted and we cried out. It was already like the 7. These 2 that we mentioned is called Makas Batsoides. Now, again, we mentioned that there's something called a Batsoides, there's something called a Kafna. Batsoides means a food shortage. Kafna means a famine. We will clarify later that even though the Mishnah is using the word food shortage, but it means it's a food shortage that if things won't change immediately, there's going to be a famine, and that's why Yitaka fasted and cried out right away. However, Yardul Tzmachim, what happens if there was partial rains, meaning one type of rain which is taka beneficial for the grains, Avalo Yardul Ilan, but the type of rain that's needed for trees did not fall. We learned this before, right? The light rains, the heavy rains, or vice versa, if only types of rains Le'ilan, Veloy Tzmachim. Or even if both the rain that's good for tzmachim and the rains that are good for ilanis fell, lozeh, but still it's not plentiful enough for us to fill up the water reservoirs. Here also, don't think, okay, fine, there'll be grain, there won't be fruit. Or we're going to have fruit. This is also considered a calamity, because we need to have both the types of rains that makes things grow, and we need drinking water. Therefore, again, Masriyan Aleim miyad. Crying out here also means we cry out and we fast. Now, if in one locale there are no rains, what's important, but the surrounding areas, yes, have rain, And as Rashi points out on the bottom, it's almost like they're being told by God, you see, the surrounding areas are getting rain, but you're being called out for some sort of bad behavior, and dafka, you don't have the rain. That's also considered a tzara. Don't say, well, I'll buy food in the surrounding area. And there's a message that Hashem is trying to tell you, and this is connected to that which it says in the pasuk in Amos, that sometimes God, who's running every detail in the world, will make it rain on one city, and God will not cause it to rain on the other city. Similarly, chelka achas timater, etc. The pasuk continues, v'chelka asher loy tamter oleha is going to be tivash. Actually, we're going to learn in the Gemara, and we also quoted this before in the Masechta, that sometimes it's no rain in one location and excessive rain in the surrounding locations. That's considered even worse. That's considered a double tzara. All these details, the Gemara is going to go into great detail. Right, so the din is, going back to the pshat, that even if the surrounding areas have rain, but if one area doesn't have it, taf yutes on the top, oiso, ha'ir, that city which got no rain, mis'ane umasra'as. Now here the Mishnah begins to specify fasting and crying out. In the beginning it meant both. Now we will see 2 times where there's a machlekes tanoim. And to clarify, we're going to separate the fasting and the crying out. I'll give you a good insight. We have Rosh Hashanah on Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is a day in which we do not fast, but we cry out. On Yom Kippur is a day that we even fast. So really, as many explain that the arguments, whether mis'ane or misras, whether we do both, right? And or whether we do one or the other is it like Rosh Hashanah, is like Yom Kippur. But all of the cities around the city that didn't get rain, even though they have rain, even if it did not rain excessively, they also have a little bit of a problem. Why do they have a little bit of a problem? Because the city that has no rain will come buy their food because they need food. So this also might create some sort of food shortage in their location. And that justifies for them to mis'anois, but not masriois. They fast, but they don't have to call out. And Abba Kiva says just the opposite, that the cities, again, the cities that have rain. But since they neighbor a city that doesn't have, so the neighboring city is going to go buy all their food. They might have a food shortage. So the opposite, they are only masriois v'loi mis'anois. So to make it clear that again, when the Mishnah just says in the beginning the concept of masri'in, it means both. Only where the Mishnah goes into these nuance do we separate the meaning of masri'in, which means either anenu or shofar or both, and fasting is separate. And another case where we have a similar machlokes. If there is a epidemic, today episode called pandemic, it used to be called an epidemic, or God forbid there is a mapoilus, all details, mapoilus will mean that there are earthquakes. It's buildings that otherwise were sturdy begin to fall, or sometimes because of tremendously strong winds. So here also, the city that has this epidemic, that is getting these earthquakes, both mis'ane umasras, for them it's a real emergency. But don't forget that if there's a big tzara in one location, people, they have to live somewhere. So they're going to go to the surrounding area. So there's going to be a shortage there. There's going to be pressure there. So again, they do one of the two, and there's a machlekes which one. Tanach says they are misanas v'loi masriyos, and Abba Kiva says the opposite, that they are masriyos and v'loi misanos. Now, how do you define an epidemic? Here's a Mishnah. Ezu dever, says the Mishnah, ir hamitzia chamesh meyos ragli. If we're looking dafke for 500 able-bodied men, that if the ratio to every 500 able-bodied men, the words that hamoitzia, many people understand is that they can produce 500 soldiers, or the point is they're strong people. And the yatsu mimenu gimel mesim, begimel yomam ze'achar zeh, dafke, if from 500, 3 pass away, but not on the same day, 1, 2, 3, 1 person per day for 3 consecutive days, that's called a dever, that's called the epidemic. The Gemara is going to specify if there's a larger, you would think if there's a larger number, it's not called an epidemic. Or if you have 3 people passed away in 2 days, you can say it's even worse. It's not called an epidemic. We're speaking of, we'll see later in the Gemara exactly. It's 1 per day in the ratio of 500. From every 500, 1. Over 3 days, 3 people passed away. Pachos mikan, fewer than this, in both ways.
Three each day.
No, I don't think so. We'll see in the Gemara. I have to see later. I think it means 1 per day. I think it means 1 per day. And by the way, wait a second, Yaakov, I'll take back. It can be more than that. It can't be less than that. Now, less than that, just to make it clear, doesn't only mean that it wasn't after 3 days, 3. No, it's 1 per day, Yaakov. Less than that means even if it's 3 people, but in only 2 days. So that it sounds like it's worse. Even if it's 3 people in 1 day, that's not called a dever. Dever is over 3 days, 3 people from 500. Pachas mikan ain't a dever. Guys, we're going to go back where everything will be more broken down or unpackaged better in the Gemara. Another detail. Says the Mishnah, there are certain calamities that even if you're not in the surrounding area, even if you are relatively far away, and how far away, all these things have to be clarified, but you also might get affected to the point where you have to right away fast and cry out, Allah shidafin. Shidafin is a certain type, it's called in English a wind blast. It's something that if it happens in one locale, it's very likely that it's going to happen all over the place, everywhere. And it ruins all of the crops. Or on something called Yeirakin. Yeirakin means that it's not just a drought, is that the color of the grains look yellow, which means that they are completely withering away. Or Al Ha'arba V'Al Ha'chasel, if you noticed in the country, different types of locusts, which might come anywhere. Or V'Al Chaya Ra'a, God made it that certain wild animals don't mingle in habitated cities. If you begin spotting these wild animals, you got to right away not only fast in this location, in all of the areas. Now again, what does all mean? We'll see later, more details. If there is any type of troops, of armies, of soldiers that are passing through your country, even if they're passing through to wage war in a neighboring country, the fact that you have soldiers traveling through an area, they can wreak havoc. For that, Masriyan Aliyah. Why? It's called a traveling calamity. So it's not localized. So therefore the tzara potentially is to a larger area, and all of them have to get involved in the fast days. Now says the Mishnah. Maisa, first story in the Mishnah. That the elders, referring to the members of the Sanhedrin, that even though they sat in Yerushalayim, but when they discovered, we'll see in a moment what they discovered, they went all over to Eretz Yisrael. Taanis, and they declared wherever you lived in the Holy Land, a fast day. Al Shanira Kamaloi Pli Tanur Shidafan Ba'ashkelon. In Ashkelon, they found a very small amount of a patch of produce, of grains, that became shidafained, that became wind blasted. How much? Only the size equivalent to the opening of an oven. So because of that, they decided that this is something that can spread to the whole land. Wow. Another, what one might have thought as small calamity, that they did not view it that way. Al sha'achlu ze'evim shnei tinoikes be'ever ha'yarden, that be'ever ha'yarden, what today is called Jordan, there were 2 wolves that God, the Rahman al-Islam, ate up and attacked and ate up 2 children, and because of that they declared a fast day all over Israel. However, it wasn't even that they ate up children. Not since they were seen in the city, and these are creatures, these are animals that normally never enter human habitat, just for spotting them, they already declared a fast day. All right, another nuance in the Mishnah, like we mentioned in the introduction, even though normally we don't cry out for personal needs on Shabbos, but here again, we're speaking about Shabbos. Number one, Aliyah, if a city is surrounded by Goyim, or if there is not a river that appears to be on the verge of overflowing, and to flood the area. Or if there is a ship that's about to sink in the sea. So we're speaking about people on the ship. There was no communication then. Today it can be even people on land if they were to find out. Rabbi Yossi Omer, when it comes to only to the above two, both to a city that's surrounded and to a sea that's about to sink, we had this in the previous Perek, the calling out is only to a neighboring area. This concept that we quoted above, we learned at Rashi above, that when there is such a tzara, and if you're not certain that God is going to answer you, then don't call out on Shabbos. Interesting concept. You can call out to the neighboring areas, they should come save you. That you can do. But to cry out in prayer, only if you're certain you'll be answered. And that's going to be...
Here, Masriyan doesn't include fasting. Or does it? When it says Masriyan, does that mean that you're going to be fasting as well, or just crying out?
So, L'chayr, again, that's... Masriyan L'chayr only means, very good, crying out, not fasting. You know what?
That wouldn't be Docha Shabbos.
I'll leave that open. I have to see later. I'll leave that open. I know that what I realized when I was learning this whole daf is that there is no consistency. Clearly, in the beginning of the Mishnah, Masriyan means both. That I saw. Then you had on the top of that Yutas, you had that Machloikas. Rebbe always does that. So I don't know. I leave that open. Other than Taanis Cholam, I don't think you can fast on Shabbos. I might be wrong. Could be for such a big calamity. Could be you could. Okay, weiter. No. I think Masriyan only means to cry out. L'chayra. You can only cry out, so that's why Rabbi Yossi is saying, cry out to your neighbor. Don't cry out to God because you don't know whether you'll be answered. Another reason why you can even be Masriyan on Shabbos, afala dever. Wow. However, even if there's an epidemic, not on Shabbos. See how careful we are not to crawl out for tzaddis on Shabbos. Next, says the Mishnah, Al kol tzara shaloi tavei ala tzibur. Really, when it comes, l'chayra, this doesn't mean to fast, Shuki. The Chachamim hold that crying out on Shabbos is something that we do. No, this is not Shabbos. That we cry out for every tzara, masri and aleyam, and could be it means also that we cry out and we fast. But the point of this stanza in the Mishnah is chutz miroiv kshamim. If there is excess amount of rains, which makes it very burdensome, but that's not called a tzara. In other words, lack of rain is a tzara. Too much rain, now even too much rain has a limit. There is amount of too much rain that is taka big tzara. We'll see that later. But generally, when there's just a lot of rain, that's not something for which we should call out to God. And now we're going to go to the story. Says the Mishnah, the Chevra told this Jew, who was nicknamed Chayna the Circle Maker, again, according to the Yerushalmi, this Chayna Hama'agal of the Mishnah is the grandson of the Chayna Hama'agal that we'll have in the Gemara soon, that the one that got put to sleep for 70 years. Okay. She spalul, that he spalul, sheyerdu geshamim. They asked of him that he should daven so rain should fall. So Amar Lohem, now this happened towards the end of the month of Adar. It was common, this happened during the times of the temple, since we needed to offer a Korban Pesach, after which it needed to be roasted, that the business of buying small ovens, the height of the business was right before Pesach. So all of the oven makers, they would mass produce all of these many ovens, and there were times that they were left outdoors, but they were not finished yet. They were not hardened yet. If it would rain on it, it would get ruined. All right, so Chayna Ma'agal told the Chevre, go and bring indoors, put under cover all of these ovens that he knew was at that phase, that if it were to rain, they will all get ruined, because he knew for sure that God is going to answer his prayers. Because it's going to fall apart due to the rain. Now, he made a circle, and he stood in the circle, and his spalel, first he davened, but didn't happen. So what did he do? Uga, literally it means he needed a cake. Now really, uga is circular, whether it's a cake, whether it's a cookie, and according to most, that's the expression of someone who's going to be in making an indentation in the ground of a circle. So it's called, he was ug and uga. And v'amad b'toicha, and he stood inside the circle. This has tremendous mystical meaning. For Amar Lefanav, many meditations in Kabbalah, that's what people used to do. They would place themselves in a mental circle and surround themselves with the olive bays, v'chule v'chule. Okay, so what happened was, v'amad b'toicha, and v'amar lefanav ribono shel olam bonecha samu panei elai, your children are turning to me. Why to me? Sha'ani keben bayis lefanecha, because I'm like a ben bayis. I'm like I'm familiar with you. I'm a member of your house. So says Chayni Hama'agel Nishba Ani b'Shimcha Gadol. I swear, she'eni zos mikan acha terachem al bonecha. I will not move from the circle until you have mercy. And God right away responded, how? His chilu geshamim min natfim. Rain began to trickle. Trickling is something, but it's not enough. So Chayni tells God, Loi kach sha'alti. That's already speaking one you can say with chutzpah. He tells God, not thank you, but I want more. He tells God, no, that's not what I asked for. Okay. Elo, what did I ask for? What am I asking for? Gishmei boides shichenu ma'aris, a lot of water, even to fill up the water reservoirs, for us to have later drinking water. When he said that, his chilu leidet bizaf. It began to pulache in Yiddish. But that's also too much. So Amar Chaydi said for the second time to God, Loi kach sha'alti, that's not what I'm asking. Ela gishmei ratzayin bracha u'nedava. Perfect, not too little, not too much. And you know what? God responded, and Yardu ketiknam. But it didn't stop. So ad sheyatzu Yisrael miYerushalayim laharabayis, people began going out of the lower parts of Yerushalayim. Why did they go to the Harabayis? Because on Harabayis there were many roofed areas. People wanted to get out of the rain. So people came to him yet again, and they told him, Kishem shispalalt aleim sheyerdu. Just like you succeeded, but you davened for the rains to fall, kachis palal sheyecholahem. Daven that it should go away, it's too much. So Amar Lahem, that's going back to the point that Masriyim Aleim Chutz Miroiv Kshamim. There's different ways of learning the Mishnah, but we're going to follow one approach. So he told them, no, I'm not going to daven for that. Because even a lot of rain, it's taka tircha, but it's not something which we cry out to God for. And the way he told it to them...
Isn't this what we learned in the first Mishnah? Be'maseh maskirin k'vus kshamim? That's k'vus kshamim. It has to be the right amount, no?
Well, even so, Samach, let me word it like this. There is a concept called a city that's going to be flooded by the water, which taka we have to daven for it to stop. Here we're speaking about that Gvudish Keshamim, it means that one drop doesn't touch the other drop in the air. But if there's falling and falling and falling and it creates a tircha, it's inconvenient, you don't daven for Hashem to take away an inconvenience. And what he told them was, we're going to learn about a certain area in Yerushalayim, and there was a big stone there, and it's called the Even Hatoyin. People who found lost articles would go there, and they would stand on that stone, and they would announce, this is what they found. They would give a very vague description, affording people who lost it to go there and to give the samanim and to get back their lost article. So what he said, what Chayna Hama'agel of the Mishnah says, is that if that stone, because of the excessive rains, completely is becoming disintegrated, and by the way, it takes a lot of rain to disintegrate a stone. If that were to happen, then I'll daven to God for it to stop, because then the water is a klala. If we didn't reach that level, it's like a very inconvenient or very, very inconvenient, but I'm not going to daven to Hashem. Again, that's just backing up this word that I'll call tzavar shaloi tov elad tzibur masriyan aleim chutz miroiv kshamim. Shalach loishim ben Shatach, who heard about the story, and he tells Chayni Hama'agel that ilmali Chayni atof, not for the greatness of who I know you are, goizrani olecha, I would put you in agnidoy. I'm gonna ban you because you spoke disrespectfully. Twice you told God that's not what I asked for. But how can I do anything to you when God doesn't do anything to you? Fakert. It's you behave in a sinful way, in my perspective, towards God, and yet the fact that Hashem is fulfilling your wishes, and the example that he gives is kebein shuhu mischata alaviv. So when you have a child, and that we have children, and they, many times children, they demand things that is not correct for them to demand it the way they demand it. And nevertheless, when a parent loves the child, and all parents love their children, they give to what their child wants. And it's regarding you, the pasuk in Mishlei, that Yismach avicha v'imecha v'sogel yoladetecha, that your father, that your mother rejoices, they're happy that they gave birth to you. No, it's, of course, that goes to every case. Every parent is happy that they gave birth. That pasuk means that parents are so happy that they gave birth to their child, that even when their child is asking from something in a non-respectful way, they love him, they give it to him anyways. So therefore, theoretically, there should have been a nidui, but that's not going to happen. All right. Now let's come back to any of these calamities. So the Chachamim made a Taanis tzibur, and in the middle of the fast day, God answered their prayers, and the calamity was removed. What now? Do you have to finish fasting? That's the next topic. Says the Mishnah, and if they were fasting, so like this. There is, from when are we prohibited to eat? We already learned above. Even when it's only a daytime fast, the prohibition begins from dawn, from alois, not from the night before, but it begins from dawn. On the other hand, as we will see in the Mishnah, the fast is really only beginning from sunset. It means you can't eat from alois, but you're not fasting alois. There's going to be another shita that says that since most people only have one meal until noon, even until noon, you can't say that you're fasting. You're not allowed to eat, but you're not fasting. The point will be that once the fast began, you got to finish it. As long as we can view what you did as not properly fasting, then you can eat even before the day is over. If they began to fast, in the case where we needed rain, and rain began to fall, but the rain began to fall even before the sunrise, before the nates, says the Mishnah, lo yashlimu. In other words, like this, even though again we were usher to eat from alois, but the fast is only considered a fast from sunset. So since it wasn't even sunset, so you didn't begin. If you didn't begin, you can eat. However, if the rain only fell la'achar neitzachama, makes sense. So you already began. If you began, then yashlimu, you have to complete the fast, which means what we call until tzei sakei chavim. Rabbi Eliezer says the same logic, but he applies it differently. Again, the prohibition, according to everyone, is from alois hashachar. But Rabbi Eliezer holds that since what happens until midday? Till midday, some people eat 8 in the morning, some people eat 9 in the morning. We learned all of the Chazal. It's only afternoon. If you ate your first meal afternoon, that's like putting in the stone in the wine skin, as we had that expression. So if the rains fell before Chatzos, you didn't really begin to fast. Anyways, you don't eat until then. So therefore, lo yashlimu, you don't need to complete it. But if the rain only began to fall Chatzos, then again, once on any level the fast began, or you're fasting, then yashlimu, you should conclude, you should complete the fast. Now, Maisa not invited a story. Even in the Mishnah, we have all these stories. Maisa, she goes to Taanis Belud, and because of a lack of rain, and God answered their fast, and God answered their prayers, and it fell before midday. So Amar Lahem Rab Tarfin, siding with the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer, so it's not, he held they don't have to complete their fast. Not only that, since rain is coming, make a simcha, make a special su'udas yamtiv. And v'ayatzu v'achlu v'shasu v'asu yamtiv. And then Rab Tarfon told him, hold on, after you're going to make this big feast, ubo bein harbayim, come back to the shul for the afternoon, after your feast, and v'karu halil hal gadol, we had this in Psachim, halil hamitzri, is the Tehillim that we say on Yom Chav Dalet, what we call Halal. Halal HaGadol is kapitel Kuf Lamed Vav. It's much shorter. It has 26 ki la'olam chazdois, including noisem lechem l'chol basar. So since that was a fast day because of a lack of rain, which would have brought about, God forbid, either a food shortage or even worse, a famine, the rain is how Hashem gives me and you food, b'ashgacha pratis. So that was, again, more details in the Gemara about this Yom Tov and about this day of fakir prayer. We're crying out in gratitude prior to us crying out in anguish. Okay, the Gemara is going to begin now with the opening line of the Mishnah. The Mishnah began saying, Seder Taanis ha'elu ha'amur. That up until now, up until the 3rd chapter, when we spoke about the Seder of fast days, it was regarding the Reviyah Rishayna. Now these words are tricky, because Reviyah means rain. Rishoina, the Gemara and the Havamina understands to mean the first of the three. We already learned above that if there is a lack of the first of the three, we don't impose the communal fast days. The communal fast days were only imposed, right, if Rosh Chodesh Kislev came and went without rain. So frek the Gemara v'rimino. No, we learned, and we're quoting a Braisa, which is very explicit, that the Reviyah Rishoinu Shniya, that if only the first, again, we had a three-way machloikas on Daf Vav, when is the first of the three? Our Mishnah followed Rebbe Meir. I think it was the 7th and the 17th, 7th, 17th, and the third day.
I think Rosh Chodesh.
Could be Rosh Chodesh. Thank you. Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so whatever those three were. But so the Braisa says explicitly that if only the first and only the second came and went, we taka have to ask for rain, but we don't fast. It's only Shlishis that we begin the fast days. I think we're quoting from the Braisa because the Mishnah did speak about the Yechidim. But anyways, so says the Gemara, no. The meaning of our Mishnah is Amar Rav Yehuda Hachi Kamar Seder Taanis Ha'amur Eimosai. You know, it's when we learned above that you have to begin fasting is Bisman Sheyatza. That's the key word here. Sheyatza Reviyah. That the rains, which rains? All of the three. Rishoina, Ushniya, Ushlishis. Only then is where we say that since V'lo Yardu Geshamim, we begin to fast, and it's also gradual. Another detail. The first three are the most lenient. But now our Mishnah is adding, if there's also a calamity, rain related, but it's different. The rain fell. The first three rains, one of them fell in the right time. And therefore, once it begins to rain, people plant. But it didn't yet grow. Why didn't it grow yet? Because the second of those rains didn't come. That's even worse. Or another case that the Mishnah gave. You begin to see that when the produce is coming out, it doesn't look the way it normally looks. That's not good. That's much worse than a delayed rain. Doing something later and better is much better than doing something quicker but not good. And that's what our Mishnah is saying, then Masriyan Aliyah Miyad. And again, this Masriyan clearly doesn't only mean crying out. This Masriyan means fasting and crying out. Now comes the key. I think this is a big yesod in today's daf. We gotta get moving. Amar Rav Nachman, dafke nishtanu. When do we take a cry out immediately? If there's a change in the produce, which means it's terrible, but if the rains will fall, there is still, by the laws of nature, a possibility for it to be saved. Avol yafshu, the way we're going to learn pshat in Rav Nachman, but if it already completely dried out, which is much worse. But it's worse that without a miracle, it's too late. So then loy means we don't fast, we don't cry out. It's don't cry over spilled milk. And Chevra, to make it clear, the way at least the way I understand the whole flow, the Gemara is going to say later otherwise. We're going to learn stories in the Spedic of Tanoim and Amoraim that cried out after the fact and God made a miracle. But the point is, you can't impose it on the community. If there's still a chance by nature for things to get changed, then you have to make a communal fast day. If you need a miracle, then go to a tzaddik. But you can't force now a communal fast day. Why do I even need Rav Nachman? The Mishnah says the words nishtanu, and the word nishtanu implies that there was only a change and not fully tried out. The Gemara says no. Rav Nachman is needed tzricha, because what happened was that what happens if it got completely dried out? It got completely dried out, and then a change happened. It became a little bit mesukin, da'akun. In other words, you have to know farming, how to interpret that. In other words, it was completely dried out. Then there's some green coming back into it. Now you might have thought, now it's already, at least there's a chance. So mal the tema that ak nita milsahi. No, it's the fact that there was some sort of, either it grew more, there was some betterment. Maybe it means just growth. If it grew a little bit more, that means, there's still a chance now for things to get better. Kamash Malan, that once everything was completely dried out by the laws of nature, it's too late. And once it's too late, you don't impose communal fast days. Said the other case in the Mishnah was, that if between the one rain and the other rain, 40 days passed, that's already considered a batsoirta and a kafna. Here's this. My makas batsoiris. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, it means maka hamavia l'dei batsoiris. In other words, the word batsoides chavre means a food shortage. We're going to have another word. The word kafna means a famine. And we are different before we turn to Amit, and we are making a difference between a food shortage and a famine. Before we go on, read inside the Tosfos. I know that we're getting a step ahead, but I want to read Kevin with his pictures here. So we have like this. Look inside the Tosfos, a letter above the Mem. Because we will see that our Gemara will differentiate between a batsoides, which means a food shortage, and a kafna, and a famine. So the Tosfos says, hold on, the Mishnah uses the words batsoides, which means a food shortage. The Mishnah says that we right away cry out and we fast. So Tosfos adds another detail. There is a scenario that's a batsoides, which is it's a lesser problem. Our reaction is not as strong. There is something called a famine. When the Mishnah uses the word batsoides, says Tosfos, the Yeshleimer the makas batsoides of our Mishnah, not like the Gemara, not what we will learn. Have a kamoy de chafna. That will be like a famine, because the Mishnah is speaking about scenarios where there might only be a food shortage now, but it will lead to a famine. But that's not what we're looking at. Gemara is going to be separating between a food shortage, which the words will be batsoides or batsoirta in Aramish, versus a kafna, a famine. So Omar Rav Nachman, now we're turning to Amid, nahara. If there is a lack of food here, but upstream, downstream, there is a place where there is food, transportation via the shipping is something very easy relative to transporting things on land. Then, even though there's a lack of food here, but since in an area that is connected to here, we're upriver, downriver, place where you can just put food on a boat and you can get it here, that's called a batsorta. Batsorta means it's taka bad, but it's not as bad as. It's not considered a kafna. Again, the reaction should not be as strong. But if there is a lack of food here, and the only way to get it is transporting it via dry land, that's the meaning, the way Rashi says, between Medinta and Medinta, there's food in another Medina. Medina doesn't mean another country. Medina means that to get it here, you have to transport it on wagons. That's already more troublesome, and there's a much greater danger that it won't make it here properly. And therefore, it's considered the famine. Now, Lamai Nafkamina, again, let's go back to the Mishnah. Whether you fast or whether you only cry out, that will be one Nafkamina. Again, our Mishnah, who uses the word batsoides, is not related to our Gemara. Our Mishnah Taka uses the word batsoides, but it means it's a batsoides that will lead into a famine. So in our Mishnah, it means to fast and to cry out. Another interesting way of measuring whether there's a food shortage or it's a famine. The normal price of grain was that with one sela, you should be able to buy the quantity of 4 sa. If with one sela, you can only buy 1 sa, that means that the prices are very expensive. That's a 400% inflation. However, if people still are able with this money to get food, it's taka very expensive. It's like Los Angeles, but you can get it. You're paying $7 here for a gas, but you can get it. That's called a shortage. That's only called relative, a batzarta. But on the other hand, what happens if the prices didn't go up? If theoretically, if with one sela you can buy 4 sa, but you can't find it, it's nowhere to be found. Arba, but v'lo shchicha. Once you go into the supermarkets and there aren't food on the shelves, I never saw that thing out of my life. But speak to your parents that go in Russia not that long ago. That's called already a kafna. So if the government forces the prices not to go up, it doesn't mean anything. If there's no food, that's called a famine. Now there's nuance in that. So the Gemara adds, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, hold on. Lo shanu. You're telling me that even if food is expensive, the first case, batzorta, it's not called a famine. That's if you have money. If food is expensive and the commoners can't afford it, that's also called a famine. If it's easy to get money is inexpensive. That's such a good modern expression. Because the interest rates are very little. So you can get your aid loan and pay who knows what, you'll pay less than 3%. So there, even though taka brings about inflation, and the peiros, which means all produce is expensive, it's taka not good, but it's only a food shortage, it's not called a famine. But if money is expensive. It's hard to get money. Even if the cost of the food is, superficially suppressed by the government who paid us bizol, so what? So what if for 1 coin you can get 4 sa, but you don't have the 1 coin? So then, masrin olav miyad. Here, shuki masrin here means, again, to fast and to cry out. To Amar Rabbi Yechanan, that nehirna means, ich gedenk, that karhava kaime dalet in besala. I remember when the prices stayed the same. Okay, this is all government-imposed economies. But there was no food. Now, the government did not allow for people to hike the prices, but still, there was no food. And he lived in Tiberia, and this is different levels of famine. We should never know that there's a certain point where the human being is starving to the point where the stomachs begin to blow up. Remember all these pictures I saw from Africa and Nebuch, these people. So as I was in Tiberia, the prices did not go up. You walked in the streets, people had these swollen hunger stomachs because no one had an isur. Guys, an isur, I think, is 180 of a selah. It's a very small coinage. No one had money, so the prices stayed low. But that, it's not just about the price, the availability. Weiter. The Mishnah gave examples that if the type of rain that's needed for tzmachim fell, but not for trees, or for trees and not for tzmachim, or for this, for that, but not for the reservoirs. So the Gemara explains what that means. Guys, we all had this in the previous perek. What type of rain is that? They got to get moving. It's light rain, we learned, is very good for the grains. It's good for the vegetables. It's good for the herbs. Trees need to have a heavier rain. What type of rain is only good for the trees and not for the tzmachim? Yeah, only heavier rains were falling. The asya nicha. Heavy rains fell, light rains never fell. That's also not good. Was what happened? That the mishkachas lo the asya razya v'nicha, but not enough to fill up the water reservoirs. Miyutu v'lo yasya. Elyahu the Tanya, but the Brisa gives another case where there can be a time that you'll have all of the water reservoirs were fed with rains, but still it was not enough, not for smachim and not for the ilanis. What case is that? The Gemara says, I'll tell you how. That if the asya b'shefichusa, if it pluches, it's like tropical rains, it downpours. Even the tree who needs to have heavier rains, but there is a limit. If the rain falls too strong, then it's not even good for the trees. Tzemach. That's the gvuras keshamim, that God holds it back. Now, if there's a big downpour, the water reservoirs will get filled, but still the agriculture did not get the type of rain that it needs. That also justifies a communal reaction through crying out, through fasting, or through both. Tanach Abanan, we learned in a Braisa. When, you have to know how to measure it. Now, these are really gemaras for the Beis Din. They are the ones who have the power to enact this communal fasting. Masrin al hoilanois, when you begin crying out because the type of rain for the trees didn't come. Only beproisa Pesach. We're going to teach half Pesach means 2 weeks before Pesach. Prior to the Chodesh Nisan, the lack of these heavier rains doesn't yet justify the Masriyan. Similarly, if they're not filled up, when does that justify the communal fast? Only b'frois hachag, big machloikas, rishonim, whether chag here means what it normally means, which is sukkos. B'frois hachag means at the end of the summer. Many others understand it doesn't make sense because the rain season in Eretz Yisrael is over the winter. So here chag will mean Shavuos, and b'frois hachag will mean 2 weeks before Shavuos. Now, furthermore, im ein lahem ma'im lishtois. However, if the problem is that no one has drinking water, there's no date for that. When you're living in a city or in a place where there's a water shortage, that's the biggest calamity. And that demands the highest level of communal fast days. Here says the Braisa, Masriyan aleim. Masriyan means for sure fasting and crying out immediately. And what do they do immediately? Immediately doesn't mean that we discovered on a Tuesday that there's a lack of water, God forbid. Even the immediate begins always on Monday. We already learned that. It's not an everyday thing. It's Monday, Thursday, Monday, Thursday, Monday, Thursday. And we also learned previously that we only begin these fast days dafka on a Monday, because whenever you begin a fast day on a Thursday, it can cause inflation. Sheni v'chamishi v'sheni. Oh, the al-kulam, another detail. No, it's how far do these fast days affect? So the al-kulan ein masriyan alein ela bi-iparkiya. It's a very interesting lashon, which let's say it means that the country shalahem. Okay. Every country is different. And these are topics that have to be further unpackaged. In other words, a neighboring country, every country has to make their own judgment whether they have a water shortage. L'chayda, because the governments were part of the solution, hopefully, of supplying water. So if I'm living in a country where there's no water shortage, even if across the border in Mexico there's a water shortage, it's not my tzara to the point that I have to fast. But pandemics, but illnesses, that's they don't know boundaries. That's the next. But the askara is some sort of disease in which the throat passageway or the ear passageway, God forbid, would become inflamed, and people would die from the inability to breathe. This is some sort of contagious disease. The point the Braisa wants to make, that the askara is worse. That the askara bisman sheyesh b'misa, if it's the type of disease that's bringing about death, then masriyan aleim. Masriyan aleim means the full-fledged fasting and crying out. Bisman she'ein b'misa, if it doesn't bring about death, then it doesn't demand masriyan aleim. And I also think that the point of the askara is that it's not like water, it's not limited to your country, because it's contagious, it goes everywhere. Another din, umasriyan ala goivai b'chol shehu. Goivai is another name of locust, that even if only a small amount were seen, that's a very bad sign. And Abshimon ben Elazar Omer, even on another type of locust called Chagav, they're also, and even if a few of them were witnessed, then all of the surrounding areas have to be masri. And Tanach Rabbanim, we learned in the Braisa masri alei lanois. But
diphtheria.
That's askara. Diphtheria. Okay. Very good. Is it contagious, Baruch, the way people understand it today?
Yes, but we get vaccinated for it.
I got it. Okay. I really think that was the contrast.
Close your throat off.
Okay.
Like that.
Tanach Rabbanim, we learned in a Braisa that when we learned above that even if there's rains, but the type of rains that are needed for trees, then we have to cry out. Masrin alei lanois, only during the 6 years of the 7th Shemitah cycle. But Masrin alei lanois only b'shar shnei shavua. Because why? Because since everything that grows on the Shemitah year is ownerless, so therefore people don't rely on those fruits. So people on the 6th year, they store. So even if there's a lack of these types of rains, it's not the end of the world, according to this Tana. But if there is a lack of the water reservoirs, that doesn't make a difference what year of the Shemitah cycle. Then afila b'shvius, we also have to be masriyan. I disagree. If there's a lack of rain for the trees, even though it's on the Shemitah year, even though most people or many people were able to put aside food for the Shemitah year, but not everyone had that ability. The poor people are relying for the fruits on the 7th year. So therefore everyone should cry out for them. Tanya idach, a similar braisa. Masrin alei lanois, according to the first Tana, only b'shar shnei shavua. Because many people at least don't rely on the produce of the 7th year. It's anyways hefker. But however, but waters that are not filled up in the water reservoirs, then you have to be masri'in even if it's on the 7th year. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, afaloi lanos. And now he adds this Braisa has another detail. And that is, even though we're not allowed to plant on the 7th year, but things that grow on their own, which is called sfichen, aftergrowths, they also need rain. So he says, Masrin ala sfichen bashvis, that if for these aftergrowths to grow, you need to have a minimal amount of rain, and you don't have it, so you won't have that sfichen, so you should also be masrian. I am not relying on it. Who's the I? The poor people are. Tanya, we learned, Amar Abelazar ben Part, from from when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, we see already a certain concealment of God's presence in the world in the way of the consistency of the rains. Nasu Gishamim, they became Tzimukim. Tzimukim means that it's limited. And Tzimukim means it's not consistent. When the temple was standing, it was exactly how you needed it, and there was a consistency. Shana, there are now times, rains, that Shegishameha Merubin, that there's taka Baruch Hashem, there's abundant rains, but it's not consistent. But V'yeshana Shegishameha Muatim. Yeshana Shegishameha, they fall on their expected times, which is mamish the ideal. So you can count on it. You know when to plant. You know when to harvest. The yeshana, that even if the amount of rain was the amount needed, but it didn't fall in the right time. She'ein geshamim yardim bismanam. And it makes that much of a difference, as the Tana, as Rabbi Elazar ben Parata explains. Shana shegishameh yordim bizmanim lamahu doime le'evet shenasam le'rabba parnasosi bechad b'Shabbos. If someone is being paid by his master on Sunday, which is a good thing, in other words, Sunday he has sufficient time to take the money and to buy produce and to prepare food for Shabbos. He's not rushed, and therefore nimtseis isa ne'efes ketikna v'nechelas ketikna. You're going to bake it properly. You're going to eat it properly. It's not going to be burnt. Even if the right amount fell, but if it fell in the wrong time, so if you only get paid on Erev Shabbos, you don't have enough time to properly make your food, and you end up eating a burnt food or unprepared food. Even if you have, in other words, the not falling on the right time is also not ideal. Going back to the first thing that I mentioned, not about the right timing, but is there enough rain? If a person gets paid a larger amount at one time, so therefore when you buy your wheat and when you grind it into flour, you are able to do so with a larger amount at the same time. And what's the advantage? There's a certain amount of loss that happens to your grain and flour whenever you grind it. Now that loss is not proportional to the amount of what you are grinding. Every time you use the machine, there's a small percent that will be lost. So obviously then, if you are grinding a much larger amount at the same time, then proportionally it's a much lesser amount of loss. The same amount of loss that happens when you grind a koir, which is a huge amount, same amount of losses when you grind a kav. Not only is that true when it comes to the grinding of the kernels into the flour, but the same thing also happens whenever you are kneading the flour into a dough. There's a small amount of loss, whatever adheres to the pot. Epis you lose, but it's not proportional. So therefore it's always advantageous to make larger batches at the same time. And that's the milah of getting the right amount of times earlier on in the year. However, even if at the end you get the same amount, but you only get it a little bit at a time, so you can only buy a little bit at a time, so you are only grinding a little bit at a time. That the loss that you would have lost if you would have ground up an entire koir, that is now the loss that you're getting by grinding up a kav. Proportional to the kav, it's much, much worse. Same thing when you need. Nim says that Isa, kama shenechelas min hakoir, that amount of loss which would have been, even if you would have needed an entire koir, that same amount is happening even though you only needed a kav. Davar acher, another expression that the Tana used. That bizman shegishameha mirubal mahu doime la'adam shemigabel esatit, when you are kneading the earth into clay. When you have sufficient waters, not only do you not use up all the waters, but the goal is properly achieved. The mixture is enough for it to be the type of clay that you need. However, if you don't have enough water, even though you end up using the same amount, but you put it in a little bit, and then a little bit, and then a little bit, and a little bit, you end up using more water, and the clay is not even as good. Mayim kolin, but v'hatit einoi mizgabel yafe, and all of that and all of that is a result of the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So the point here all is never to view nature, including the weather, as nikra. That's just the way it is. Nothing is just the way it is. The idea of Hashgacha Pratis, which is why whenever there is a little bit of a calamity, not to brush it aside, oh, that's the way it is. Sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's too cold. No. Hashem is involved in everything, and whenever something is not ideal, just a general concept, so just recapping, we're going to continue the next story in the next year. So if something is considered, and Chazal determined that a minor challenge, then we begin in a gradual way reacting. If something is considered a huge, immediate challenge, then we impose the highest level of fast days immediately. But let's go back to what Rav Nachman taught us. But if something already happened and there's nothing we can do, then we don't force communal fast days, but Abed, now we'll learn a whole Pedic. And the whole Pedic is now we're going to begin with the stories, with amazing stories where we see that Hashem answers tzaddikim who sometimes pray for miracles to happen beyond the nature. So you can't impose it, but there's always the possibility, dafke, because God is almighty, so the gilui of godliness, as the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, happens through the miracles that are performed through tzaddikim, and God willing, next year we will begin with the first of the many amazing stories with Nagdimim Ben Guran to be continued.